year, but it's unclear how many are still and how powerful they still are. But they used to be quite an important part of daily life and the structure of society. So the movie kind of depicts that. But I think even in 2005, I think the power of the triads was already much less than it is depicted in the movie. So that's the history of the triads. So I mentioned that yesterday, that they trace back sort of mythologically their history to the Ming or to the Qing dynasty. And they started as these organizations, sort of underground organizations, fighting against the Qing to restore the Ming dynasty. So that's their myth of origin. That's where they come from. So a few hundred years back already. Later on, they became more involved with crime, supposedly. So now they're more like criminal organizations. The Qing dynasty ended in 1911. So that function of being sort of a resistance organization, if it ever existed, had no meaning anymore after the fall of the Qing. So all of these things, since the 80s, you can't really show them in Hong Kong movies, unless you put them, they become automatically category 3. So that's sort of, I think, X-rated in the States. You have to be over 18 years old to see the movie. Most directors will try to avoid this kind of scene in movies because you automatically would exclude an important part of the audience. That's another thing that Johnnie To is famous for in many Hong Kong gangster films. There's just not many women in many of those gangster films. Although you do have subgenres of films focusing on female action heroes. Maybe you know Michelle Yeoh. She's also in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, many big movies. She moved to Hollywood as well. So she is famous for starting her career in these action films. She was a cop in the 80s in a lot of sort of pop action movies. So you do have these interesting genres of films where women are actually very powerful, more than you would see in Hollywood films. So one of the things that Johnnie To set out to do with his election films is to actually create a more accurate picture of the triads, because a lot of Hong Kong gangster films, they're famous for gun action. But actually in Hong Kong, there's very strict gun laws. Very few people own a gun. So gangsters usually don't have guns. When they fight each other, it's usually with these big knives that you see them use in one scene in this film as well. So that's maybe one of the reasons why the violence is also, it's not so impersonal maybe as a rain of bullets. If you hack someone, it becomes a bit more intimate, and it's also more one-on-one. It's a combination of some of these elements that film will already be described as film noir, because it's a critical category. It's used by the people who write about film retrospectively. It's not a category originally that was used by the filmmakers themselves. So when these films were made in the 40s and the 50s, they were not thinking we are making a film noir. They were thinking we are making a detective film, or we are making kind of violent melodrama. When these films then arrived in France, they are received, and there the critics start to talk about these films as film noir. They see, oh, there's this trend in American cinema. They all seem quite dark. You have various characteristics. Seems to connect these various films together, which previously were conceived of as maybe belonging to very different genres. So those French critics invent or use this term of film noir to describe these films. But it's only later on, when this term moves back to the United States, that filmmakers in the United States start to make films consciously as being film noir. So that's especially since the late 60s that starts. So you have in the 70s, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, Paul Schrader, that's famous as neo-noir. They are consciously copying those films from the 40s and the 50s, but updating them in color, because it's not in black and white anymore, and changing and adapting them to the times, but still drawing on many of the things that have come to be defined as film noir. But so the fact that it was defined by critics makes it a little bit arbitrary, especially for the 40s and the 50s. You will find almost no film that combines all of these things that I listed here as film noir. So that's also the difficulty of using this term when you talk about Hong Kong cinema, because film noir can be so many different things. How do you decide whether something is film noir or not? So Better Tomorrow, it's also, so it's almost a little bit subjective, depending on how you feel yourself about the film. So I would say John Woo moves closer to film noir, especially in The Killer. You can find it a little bit in The Better Tomorrow, but he doesn't go as far as Johnnie To. Johnnie To is extremely cynical in his films. There is no brotherhood, there is no heroes in the triad society. From that perspective, you could say it comes closer to the kind of film noir worldview, very cynical, very dark worldview. And then also in his images, you can see he likes to use these chiaroscuro images, these dark shadows. And this is one fabricated part of the triads, is that they are having a democratic election. This is not something that the triads actually do, as far as I know, but in this film, this is introduced in a triad setting. So he's using these triad conflicts to talk about the political situation in Hong Kong. The chief executive in Hong Kong is also elected by a very small group of people. I think it's 1,200 people, all sort of elites, often with ties to China. And so that means that China, or mainland China, Beijing, can decide who will win the election. So in this, again, set you have in this film you have a small circle election as well, where you have these old senior members of the society who have the power to cast the vote, but then all the regular triad members, they don't have any voice in this, they don't have a vote to cast. And so the film then shows how this system leads to a lot of corruption. Everyone is sort of fighting and struggling for power, and they're just, votes can be bought, which is something, if you have so few people involved, you can try to buy the support to win the election. So that's the main way in which the film seems to be commenting on the political situation in Hong Kong. Already in the first movie, there is some connotation with this dragon baton, and the fact that it is located in China. The symbol of power is something that has to be gotten from China before they can actually take charge. So this returns in the second film, but they elaborated on it a little bit more. What you see here is that the really the most respected figure in the tribe, he has been murdered actually early on in the film. Here he's going to be buried, and GB realizes that he doesn't really have any power anymore. There is no even small-scale election anymore, so he's putting his baton in the coffin. That's the end of autonomy for the tribes in Hong Kong. The second film really pushes this political allegory a little bit further.